Last time we were finishing up the pre-war era and we were just beginning to talk about the interwar. When we looked at Russian art, it overlapped. The Russian modernism we looked at last time, some of it was before the World War I and before the revolution. I almost said the French Revolution, before the Russian Revolution, and some of it was after, into the 20s. But the Russians weren't making avant-garde art after the mid to late 20s. Lenin was still a supporter, but by the time Stalin is in power, he is not a supporter of modern art, and it is completely suppressed. And we are going to talk about that when we get to the 30s. We're going to look at totalitarian art and what was happening in the 30s, but we're not going to get there yet. So today is the first day we're sort of officially looking at interwar art. And interwar art is simply the art between World War I and World War II. In other words, it's primarily the decades of the 20s and the 30s. And this is my specialty. This is finally, I teach the whole history of 30,000 years of the history of art. And then finally we get to the 1920s. It took a long time to get here, as it usually does. But it's a really fascinating period. I'm absolutely obsessed with it, particularly the 20s. So this is the age of high modernism. This is when modernism reaches its goal and peaks. And this is how we're going to divide up the period. We're going to look at international constructivism, and we're going to look at that today, at least some of it. We'll look at the Stil, which is a movement, which is a Dutch movement in art, and we'll look at the Bauhaus, which is something that happens in Germany. And then next time we'll look at modern architecture, because that really is all under the same umbrella of international constructivism, and we'll talk about that term. I used that term last time when I was talking about the Russians, because they were also using a sort of constructive point of view, and we'll bring that back and talk about that more today.
Are you meaning to share your screen, Peggy?
Did I not do that?
Not yet. At least I don't see it. That's all right. I just thought I said, I'm not used to looking at Peggy. Oh, that's because she shares her screen.
I hadn't a clue that I'd forgotten to do that, because it looks the same from here. I can't tell. Yes, actually, I will most definitely do that. Is that better? Are you seeing it now?
That does it. Thank you.
List. Okay. Thank you for telling me before I got too far along. Okay, good. So this is how we're dividing up the period. So first we'll look at international constructivism, the Dutch and the German today. Next time, modern architecture. And then after that, we go back and look at a second sort of broad umbrella of movements that was happening simultaneously. So this constructivism we talked about last time and that we'll talk about today is not the only thing that was happening in the 20s and 30s. There were also,
I'm sorry,
no problem.
The Cassidys had car trouble. And
Oh,
couldn't get it out.
Well, we're just thrilled that you're
And
here.
I brought my son and daughter.
Wonderful. That's great. Wonderful. That's fine. That's great. We're thrilled. All right, we've got some more people coming in, everybody. So that's great. So we're just doing some introduction right now. We haven't really started talking about anything yet. I'm introducing the period of the 20s and the 30s, the period in between the two world wars. That's really how we bracket the 20th century. There's before World War I, there's between the wars, then there's after World War II. And that model holds up until about 1970, and then everything changes again, but we're not going to worry about that. The second type of art that, yeah, here's a couple more of these if you want them, 2 more sets. The second type of art I'm lumping together and just calling it fantastic art, Fantastic simply meaning that it's made up, it's invented, it's a fantasy, it's not realism. And that's an umbrella that includes several different things. It includes a movement called Dada, it includes some general fantasy art, and then most importantly, surrealism, which is something most people are somewhat familiar with. And we'll see how the two responses of these two groups, the constructivists versus the sort of fantasy art people, they are both responding to World War I, but in different ways. The constructivists are going to be responding very positively to World War I, as if this is sort of the dawning of a new age, a new era. And well, we already saw the Russians doing that last time, but they weren't so much responding to World War I as they were responding to their own revolution, which was happening at the same time. But it's the same idea. A big cataclysm happens and they think this is great, it's over now. But we will talk more about World War I later, the horrors of World War I, because the second group, the sort of fantasy artists, they're responding negatively. They see it as a horrible thing, and their response is going to be very different. And that's when we'll talk more about the realities of that war. Constructivists didn't see the realities of it. They saw it as the beginning of a new era. This thing happened, it's over now, and we're moving into this new utopian era. The 20s was a very utopian era. I already talked about the utopian architecture a little bit, but there was a, roaring 20s. This was the roaring 20s. It was all very optimistic until, of course, at the end of the 20s, and it all collapses and it can't think that way anymore. And then lastly, we'll look at the 30s, particularly the effects of the Great Depression, the rise of totalitarianism, this ultra-conservative movement of the 30s. As optimistic and utopian as the 20s were, the 30s were exactly the opposite. They were literally a crash, conservative, pessimistic, dark. And that's what I love about the period. It's such an interesting change that happens between the 20s and the 30s. And that's when we'll look at things like in this country, the WPA, Federal Arts Project, all of that art. But we'll also look at what was happening in Germany, what was happening in Russia under totalitarianism. So that's how we're going to cover this period. But today, we're not doing all of that. We're just going to look at the international constructive movement. Why are you beeping at me? Okay, there we go. In the constructivists, we're going to see a very strong influence of the symbolist movement. And I'm reminding you again of what that was, that late 19th century movement that rejected realism. The symbolists are going to have a very strong impact in the 20th century. This is something that I think scholarship used to ignore. I mean, when I was in school, particularly undergrad, the symbolists weren't credited with anything. By the 80s and 90s, people were beginning to recognize how influential this movement was. It was a movement that rejected realism, that said art should not be just merely depicting what you see around you. That's just very common. Why would you do that? Art should be creating things from the mind. It should be looking at big, important things and looking inside and studying those internal truths. And remember, they focused on these human experiences, these sort of universal human experiences, like the idea of anger and love and jealousy and all these sort of universal sort of abstract ideas. That's what they thought art should be focusing on. And they used form metaphorically to express those universal ideas. These were just a couple of examples that we looked at sort of last fall. The DeVille Parsifal figure, that reference to Parsifal is a reference to the search for the Holy Grail. The search for the Holy Grail was a very popular subject in the late 19th century as a metaphor for the idea of searching for something, searching for some great truth or some secret knowledge. If you want to suggest that, referencing the Holy Grail is a good way to do it because it becomes the symbol of that. Moreau's apparition, we talked about. That's a Salome with the head of John the Baptist. And we talked about those hundreds and hundreds of images of these femme fatales in the 19th century, and how that symbolically referenced the rising position of women in society in the late 19th century. But anyway, that idea that images are symbolic of something grander than themselves, that's what's going to influence constructivist art. We talked about it with Mayevich, the Russians. I'll repeat that because I brought back one of his works so we can look at it again. And we're definitely going to see it in others. This is another symbolist work. Orpheus was a common symbol. We've got the disembodied head. These were all symbols of turning inward, of rejecting the external world and turning inward, eyes closed. The first person I want to talk about is certainly one of the best known and most important artists of the century, Piet Mondrian, the Dutch artist. Mondrian was just a little bit older than some of the artists he was contemporary with. He was born in 72. And, by the 1890s, he was teaching actually full time. He was a teacher. He actually taught for a while, he taught the Froebel kindergarten system, which we're going to talk about and how important that is in just a few minutes. But in 92, he stops teaching and decides to be, a real painter. And he went to the Amsterdam Academy. He was working in the 90s in the Netherlands. He's very influenced by the symbolist movement, and his early work is very symbolist. He's influenced by two things here, the symbolist movement and Dutch realism. The last Dutch artist we looked at, if you've been coming to earlier classes, like when we looked at the 19th century, and then if you were with us with the Western survey, certainly Van Gogh was the last Dutch artist we looked at, and before him, Rembrandt. And both of those artists were very much in the realist tradition. Realist art is very much a Dutch tradition. And realism means you're looking at and depicting the world around you that you live in. Realism doesn't refer to your painting technique. It has nothing to do with your brushwork or whatever. And Van Gogh was a realist. You may look at his work and say, that doesn't look realist, but that is realism. He only depicted what he saw in front of him. And that's a true realist. I mean, he said, I can't paint something if it's not in front of me right now. And he tried doing that, and it was a terrible failure, and ended up badly. But nonetheless, yes, Mondrian at this point is still tied to the real world. But very early on, he's developing, under the influence of symbolism, a sort of symbolic language of form. In this case, a kind of line. One of the things that dominates both of these images is the trees, right? And the branches on the trees. He's using these tree branches as a symbol for a kind of energy or life force. This is the symbolist line was often very curvilinear like this, and they use line suggestively. And in this case, he's beginning to see the tree branches. And we're going to see that developing in his art and changing, but that's the symbolist part of this. These aren't pure realism. It's realism as interpreted through the mind of a symbolist who's looking for symbolic forms in nature. So in this case, it's the tree branches that intertwine, and there's a sort of life force, right? It's like vegetation. It's an energy that's in those tree branches. Speaking of our friend Van Gogh, Van Gogh, however, this is considered realism in the way we use the term. Not, people use the term differently. If you want to use it differently, that's fine. But in terms of the way I use the word, and historians use the word, this is realism because he saw this. He was standing in front of it, but he's clearly giving it a personal interpretation. He's intensifying everything. That was Van Gogh's thing. And he is most definitely still tied to the real world. Now, in 1909, Mondrian joined the Dutch Theosophical Society. And I've mentioned the Theosophy before. Kandinsky was a member of the Theosophical Society. Brancusi, the sculptor. Remember, Theosophy was and still is a sort of combination of religion and philosophy. That's where the word comes from, theology plus philosophy. And it's going strong right now. There's a huge revival in the sort of, it's a new age thing. I know this because the international headquarters of the International Theosophical Society is about a mile from where my brother lives in Wheaton, and I've been driven by their bill. Is this massive structure. And it's a mix of Western and Eastern philosophies. There's a little bit of Old Testament, a little bit of New Testament, a lot of Taoist ideas, a lot of, it's a mixture of philosophies. And it actually began in the 19th century, and believe it or not, in New York. It was created by this Russian woman, this expatriate Russian woman, Madame Blavatsky, who was living in New York at the time. And it became really big in the late 19th century, throughout the 20th, and it's having a real sort of revival right now. Really interesting ideas. But the main ideas that we saw Kandinsky and Brancusi being influenced by was the idea that reality is not what you think it is, that reality is not on the surface. Reality is what you can't see, not what you see. And of course, if you're an artist, that's going to affect you because you're dealing with what you see and what you don't see. So as an artist, that's an interesting idea. We saw Kandinsky trying to depict sort of the internal as opposed to the external. As a core idea, it's decidedly anti-realist, because that's what realists did. They depicted the surface appearance of things, exactly what something looked like. But that's not truth. That's not the true reality. How do you look inside something? And we're going to see how this all ties together. So we already saw it in the Russians. So here's our tree again, now clearly taking on this energy. These colors come right from Van Gogh, these blues and reds, these intensification of color. He's influenced by Van Gogh here clearly, but it's still about that energy of the tree and the life force of the tree, just called red tree. I'm taking you through his thought pattern, how he got from point A to point B. Because I think for this artist, it's important to understand, if I just take you in at point B, you're not going to have a clue what this means. You have to see the process to see how he got there. For Mondrian, the aspect of theosophy that he was most intrigued by was the influence of the Taoist ideals. And if you were with us last spring when we looked at Asian art, and I talked about Chinese art and we talked about the Tao, this is the symbol, of course. Most people are familiar with that today. One of the things I've found most interesting after teaching for 30 years is how students have changed. When I first started teaching, very few people in this country knew much about Eastern philosophies at all. It was just a small group of people that really sort of were involved. But we've reached a point where so much of it is common knowledge today. It's like everyone knows so much more about it than they used to. The Tao, sort of the key ideas here, truth is not what you see on the surface. True knowledge comes from revelation. And we talked about that a bit last time with the Russians, that revelatory idea, related it to icons, right? Russian icons, and how they were about revelation. We'll see that again today. And that ultimate truth can be expressed through the balance of forces that define the human experience. And this is what comes from the Tao, because the Tao is all about that. That's the image you see here, is the yin and yang symbol of Taoism, the yin and yang being the two forces that are kept in balance, that all experience is defined by two things. It's a way of seeing the world dualistically. You see everything in twos, up, down, left, right, good, bad, male, female. That's a way to see the world. It's a model for interpreting the world. It's not the only model. Other people have had models where they see everything in threes. There's a model of seeing everything in fives. I mean, models are never right or wrong. You can construct any model. You can construct a lot of different models, and they may all work. So none of them are necessarily any truer than any other. It's a point of view. a model either works or it doesn't work. That's important. Well, the dualities work. It does work to see the world this way. So if that's how you see the world, and Mondrian did as a follower of theosophy and therefore the Taoist duality, then he's going to be seeking a way to express that. Because if he's interested in expressing sort of the underlying nature of things, of reality, then this is a language that he can use, the language of dualism. So let's see how he develops that language. Here's one late symbolist work of his. Now, this has nothing to do with realism. This is a complete rejection of it. And I swear I've seen this in the Nelson Gallery a couple of years ago, that this was somehow, at least in my mind, I remember briefly seeing this one trip to the Nelson. It was like right after I got here, so it had to be in 2017. Does anybody want to tell me that I'm right? Please, somebody tell me I'm right, because I can find no proof of this anywhere. But in my head, that happened. Okay. Okay, I'm going to set that aside.
Where is it usually?
I read what, I can't remember what, but it's definitely not here. And it's definitely in another well-known museum, but I still swear it was here, even if just like for a week. But there's no documentation of that I could find online anywhere. Anyway, I'm going to keep following that up because I don't think I'm crazy. Anyway, hopefully I'm not crazy. But this, the dominance of the blue, I can't help but be reminded of, remember Picasso's blue period where the symbolists were influencing him. This is right. This is the same sort of phase that he's going through. Now let's go back to the trees, because what's happening next? Well, he goes to Paris in 1911. What's happening in Paris in 1911? Well, the Cubists are on everybody's radar. That's all everybody's talking about. Their first exhibit together in 1911. So of course he's going to be influenced by it. It's obvious here what he's influenced by. He's seen analytic cubism. He's seen the way Picasso and Braque are using this sort of gridded structure to sort of hang forms on. But unlike the sort of like the accordionist on the right, which is really, really very, emotionless. It's not about emotion. It's purely about form. Mondrian hasn't let go of this symbolist meaning in his work. We're still seeing this energy and power of the tree. It's very dynamic. It's just, with this overlay of this other sensibility. By 1912, however, things are beginning to change in the flowering apple tree. The basic core of the tree is there. So he has not abandoned the natural world. It's clearly still there, but he's turning away from representation. And remember, representation, literally the word is represent. To represent, you're presenting again. You're representing something. In other words, you're giving us this thing you're seeing and you're presenting it again. So representation is a repeating of what's already happened, a repeating of what you already see. And he's beginning to move away from that, but it's still there. If you know where he's coming from. If you saw nothing but this and didn't see the title, you may not realize what this is, but we do have the title and we do know where it came from. So there is still the remnant of the tree, but it's beginning to break down. It's becoming more about finding equivalent forms to the underlying process of the tree, as opposed to what the external appearance of the tree is. And remember when we looked at Brancusi's sculpture last time, he was looking for equivalent form, something equivalent to the essence of the thing. Remember the bird in flight? That didn't look like a bird, but it was meant to be equivalent to birdness. So this is sort of the equivalent to treeness as a symbol of life force. 11 and 12, he's still in Paris at this time. And I love these two. I find these two to be really interesting. The two ginger pots, because things are changing here so very quickly. The one on the left, still life with ginger pot. you still, in the one on the left, you still feel that you're in the real world, you're entering the space. And there's clearly a space there for you to enter into. You can recognize forms that are filling that space. But the one on the left, that space is beginning to dissolve, and he's beginning to embrace this more complex interpretation. Still clearly analogous to those forms, but they're starting to disappear. He hasn't left Paris yet at this time. This series, it's a series called the Church Facade series, and they're paintings based on church facades in Paris. So he's still in Paris. When World War I breaks out, he's forced to go home. He has to go back to the Netherlands and he leaves Paris. And that's this year, 1914. But at this point, he's still in Paris. And so we're finding now this search for these analogous forms and shapes. Again, the title is still tying it to the physical world. We have the one thing that's really architectural here is this pediment, this sort of broken pediment down here at the bottom, which makes it feel to me like he's sort of looking up. He's, all those church doors, and you have the pediment over the door. And there's usually forms and shapes, a sculpture often like above that. So it's as if you're like looking up. At least that's how I see them. I don't know if that's his intent. But he's becoming enamored, not so much now with those sort of organic shapes of the tree branches that symbolize living forms, but under the influence of Taoism, he's beginning to see the vertical and the horizontal forms as the dominant symbols. Because in Taoism, yin and yang, particularly the male, female, active, passive, are often symbolized by vertical, horizontal, where you have the yang male form is symbolized by the vertical, that's the active form, while the passive and female form, don't blame me, this is Taoism, is symbolized by the horizontal. And what's interesting is we have the same symbols in Western art without any relationship to Taoism. The vertical has always been the spiritual, symbolized the spiritual, where the horizontal symbolizes the sort of earthly. So you've got the physical because of our horizon. It has to do, it's one of those symbols that is related to our physical bodies as human beings, because we are beings that walk upright. When we are vertical, we are alert and awake, and it draws you upwards to the heavens. And when we're horizontal, we're passive, and that ties you to the earth. And there are all sorts of different examples of that, but that idea is there, and he's caught that idea. And so for him, vertical and horizontal forms are primal forms. They're primal symbols of Taoism, and they're the essential symbols of that sort of duality, that sort of balance. As soon as he had to go back to the Dutch, and I love this series, he had to go back to Amsterdam, and he does this Pier and Ocean series, which is really interesting. And this is a powerful series because it's right on that cusp. Is this non-objective or is this not non-objective? It is non-objective, but it's still tied somewhat to the physical world. And let me show you what I mean here, because what we've got are forms that are equivalent to what he's depicting. By using this oval shape on the canvas, he's suggesting the sort of fluidity of the water, the sort of endlessness of the ocean as you look out on it. The verticals and horizontals are the essential elements of looking out at the horizon. You've got horizontal horizon, you look up to the vertical sky, but in reality, this is what you see at the pier. You have the horizontal pier that reaches out into space. You have these piers that hold up the walkway. I mean, there's a visual connection to the forms he's depicting here. Like over here, you've got the long pier, and then the horizon, and then the vertical piers. It's there. You can see where these forms are coming from. What I love about this series and this piece is he's giving us at the same time a kind of flatness but at the same time, there's depth, because notice how he's spacing these verticals and horizontals. Down here, closer to you, they're farther apart and wider and taller and longer. And as you go higher and higher, they're getting tighter together. That's perspective. That's pure linear perspective. It's exactly the way a Renaissance artist would have depicted the scene. Things that are closer to you, you see as bigger, right? And farther away, they're smaller and closer together. So he's actually using a kind of abstract perspective here to add to this sort of message. And these sort of random colorations are like, the waves and the oceans. They aren't depicting them, they're suggesting them. So they're suggesting these characteristics of the sea and of the pier and ocean. A very important, yeah, please.
Were other artists seeing this at the time? See it as you're discussing it in terms of the closer, bigger,
yeah,
further, smaller.
Right.
Would they see that as ocean? I mean, what would they?
Well, I can't get in. I don't want to speak for someone else and get in their head, but the issues he's dealing with are the same issues everyone is dealing with. So he's not thinking any differently than everyone else. He's not experimenting with things. I mean, in 1915, many artists had done non-objective works of art. So this is hardly the first to do that. And I think his works are pretty, his title, he's got the title there. Once he tells you this is pier and ocean, then you can see it's pier and ocean. So I have no doubt this series would have been easily understood. Not necessarily work that's coming up, however. It becomes more obscure. And we'll talk about that. Yeah.
Is he the first one to use titles that are numbered with numbers?
That's a good question. First, when did Kandinsky? No, Kandinsky's 1915. No, Kandinsky's doing it before this. Kandinsky's doing it by 1912. He's numbering them like composition, using these musical terminologies, composition 12 and symphony 14, whatever. So I'm not sure he's the first. That's a good question. I'm not sure. Yeah.
What is the other picture?
Both you mean here on the screen?
Yeah.
One is sort of looking above the walkway and the other one is below it.
Did Mondrian do this one?
No, those are just photographs of piers and oceans. They have nothing to do with Mondrian. I found those. So he wasn't looking at those, but he was at the ocean looking at piers. And so I just found a pier because it seems reasonable that piers look like piers pretty much everywhere. So yeah, no, I just got these to kind of make the point of what piers look like. So he's referencing that idea. But the next step beyond that, and it is a sort of sequence of steps, is moving toward, he saw, now he's made the break. By this time, by 1917, he's made the break. And now he's, in fact, he's created a name. He started writing about what he's doing. He calls his style neoplasticism, new plastic art. And plastic is a term we use, artists then used, referring to, it's very, very hard to define what that term means. I know what it means, I feel what it means, but it's very hard to just define it. It has to do with how you manipulate form on the surface. So he's saying it's a new way of using and moving and manipulating form on the surface is basically what neoplasticism means. It's a vague term that doesn't actually mean a whole lot, but that's what he's referring to. Complete break with the natural world. And also he's, by this time he's influenced by, I think, Kandinsky, even though Kandinsky was working in a very expressive way, but he's sort of breaking down the traditional relationships of forms. I mean, traditionally, there's a relationship between, say, lines and color. Generally, lines are used to bind colors. Like if you've got a color area, it's going to have a line around it, and they relate in that way. In this composition, again, he's using the word composition, which is the word Kandinsky used as well, which is why I think he's influenced by Kandinsky. They don't relate to one another. They're free moving on the canvas. So this is just sort of an experimental phase that he's going through, but now he's limited his forms to vertical and horizontal. That's all we see here. There are no diagonal lines, nothing that takes you out of that sort of duality, that balance between forces. Images like this are sort of happening at the same time that we have all these people we looked at before when we looked at Cubism. The Purists, for example, these are sort of the post-Cubist artists, or artists who were influenced by Cubism. Remember, we looked at the Purists. There's a whole bunch of them working in right after the war, 17, 18, 19, 20, who were influenced by Cubism, but they all thought it kind of failed and should have gone in slightly different direction. And remember, the Purists felt that it wasn't sort of clean enough. And so you have people like Generet here who are painting forms like this. And what Modern is doing isn't that far from it. The difference being one is a realist and one is dealing with abstract ideas. They both showed at the same gallery. I mentioned that gallery at the time. The Rosenberg Gallery was showing Leger, it was showing the Purists, it was showing Delaunay, but it was also showing Mondrian. And that gallery had their own publishing house, and they published the Distill Manifesto, which is Mondrian. I forgot to even define the word distill as a movement. It just means the style. It doesn't mean anything. They called it the style. It's just a reference to this Dutch style called distill. They published the Purist Manifesto, which is written by Generet and Ozenfam that we looked at before. So all these ideas are in the air. It's a very experimental period. After Cubism sort of initiated these experiments, some wanted to use these ideas in a realist context, some wanted to use it in a more symbolist context. Rapid changes after 1917. This is where we begin to have the works that are more recognizable as Mondrian. Now is where we get to his later writings. He published his small book, Neoplasticism, in 1920. He's written quite a lot. His writings are very interesting. He's an extremely intelligent person, and they're wonderful to read. I mean, they're all still in print out there. You can always find his readings. They're probably all online. So, I highly recommend his reading because he takes you through his thoughts as to how he gets here. One of the things he does in Neoplasticism, he talks about the square, and he refers to it as the theosophical cross. And I love this reference because it takes me back to the Russians, and it allows us to think about the relationship to theosophy. So why would that be the theosophical cross? What's it got to do with theosophy? And why does he reference the cross? Because he doesn't mean it in a religious context. He means it in an iconic context, in the same way that the Russians' modernism related to religious icons. But Russian art was more mysticism, it was really tied to religion and the mysticism going back to the icons. Mondrian's not really dealing with mysticism. He's dealing with theosophy, which is spiritual, but not in a Christian context. Okay, what is a cross? A cross is an iconic image. When we talk about images, we talk about them as being either narrative or iconic. A narrative image is telling you a story. An iconic image is when you're given some sort of form that symbolically stands for a whole lot of big ideas. In art, for example, it's the difference between a cross. I mean, if you're looking at a work of art and there's just a cross on it, or a work of art and there's a cross on it with Christ on the cross. Those are two very different things, and they're two very different conceptual things. An image of Christ on the cross is a narrative. It's telling you the story of the crucifixion. But a cross, why would there be a cross without Christ on it? Because in the narrative, that's not that relevant. The cross is only relevant in the narrative if Christ is on it. But if this isn't used in a narrative sense, the cross becomes an iconic symbol of everything that crucifixion stood for. And those are two different ideas, one conceptual and one physical. And so if you're thinking of the square, you're not thinking of like a box or a physical thing as part of a story. You're thinking of it as something that stands for something bigger than itself. So what could this square stand for? To Mondrian, a square is a merging of two vertical lines and two horizontal lines. So it's the essence of the dualism, of the Taoist dualism, the yin and yang. It's as much a symbol of the yin and yang as that Taoist symbol with the curve in it that symbolizes the two things, two halves, the yin and yang half. But you could also symbolize that idea with two verticals and two horizontals. So it's sort of the modernist. And there is a name for that Taoist symbol. It's a Chinese name, and I can't remember what it's called. So for that Taoist symbol, I almost had it a minute ago. It's like anyway, it's that symbol, which is different from the Russian. We're going to come back to the Russians and compare them in just a moment. But there's one more thing that's filtering into this image that I want to talk about, and that is kindergarten. Now, why on earth am I talking about kindergarten? Well, if you read the handout, you know I'm going to talk about kindergarten because it was really important and it's just incredibly interesting. Had any of you heard of Froebel or Froebel's concept of kindergarten at all before this? It's German. It begins in Germany in the 1830s, but it spread here and there throughout Europe. We know that Kandinsky attended a Froebel school in Italy when he was young. It's going to feed into his sensibility. We know that Mondrian taught and was familiar with it. We know that actually it was taught in quite a few places in this country. There were a lot of German immigrants and others in America. It's just little pockets. You never know where here and there it would just pop up. And I will tell you now, it is still being taught. You can buy any of the tools that you need. You can buy them online. You can look them up. There are Froebel gift sets, as they're called, and we'll talk about that in a minute. They're used by homeschooling. The most famous person to have studied in this system is Frank Lloyd Wright, and we'll talk about that when we get to him, but he talks about it all the time. He credits the Freudian system as being a major influence on all of his architecture, but nobody really took it beyond Frank Lloyd Wright for a long time. And then, I don't remember when was the Brusterman article published? 97. This is when people began realizing it's far more important than just Frank Lloyd Wright, that a lot of these modernists, it changed how they saw the world. And certainly for somebody like Mondrian, you have to consider this because of what it is. Radical new idea. You know, the Germans were huge on educational toys. German toys, they still are, you know, the most important educational toys are German, but even throughout the 19th century, they made a lot of educational toys. If a child's going to play with something and have fun, why not be something that they can, you know, learn something from as well? And this is the tradition this comes from. But he created a system that taught children the interconnectedness of all things in life, in the world. I think it's brilliant. I would love to. I think it should be taught everywhere. I think every child should get the Froebel system. I think it would change the way we think about the world we live in. But he created this system that had three parts to it, or what he called the three realms, and that these were the building blocks of the universe, what he called forms of nature, which are any sort of living things, people and animals and trees and plants and anything like that. Forms of knowledge, which particularly centered on mathematics and science. And then forms of beauty, which is art, which in this context were mostly like design work, making beautiful patterns and symmetrical patterns and designs. That's what he means by art. And he found a system that through the years, and it was a system that ran for several years, that if you introduce children to ideas that link these three realms, they will grow up to understand that all of these are connected, that living things are connected to science and mathematics that are also connected to art and beauty. And he did this through a series of what were called first, the gifts is the first part of it, as this is what they were called. And these are the younger children. They would have these gridded tables. They would work on gridded tables. The things they would work with, the gifts they would work with, would start out two-dimensionally, and then as they moved up into later years, they get three-dimensional forms to work with, and they would build and create things using the same tools, different kinds of things. And the example here in this article is that, life forms are tangible, knowledge forms are math, but he might give you like 8 like cubes, and maybe you would build like a chair, out of those 8 cubes. Then you'd use the same 8 cubes and you would make a formula of 4 plus 4 or 2 plus 2 equals 4. You'd move them around as if they were part of a mathematical equation. And then thirdly, you take those same squares and maybe you'd lay them in a kind of random but beautiful kind of pattern and design. They can make something pretty. But it's the same blocks, the same forms do all 3 things. That's the idea, is that whatever you're working with, whether it's little pieces of paper or sticks or marbles or whatever, you use the same ones to do these 3 different things that have to do with these 3 realms. And it taught a whole generation, or multiple generations, a way of thinking about the world and ordering the world in a particular context. And I think using the gridded squares also embedded in a lot of these young modernist minds the role of this gridded square as a kind of foundation for life. The grid is the essential metaphor of life. It's the place or space where life happens. And you can speak through this grid. It's what, there's a lot that's been written about the grid in modernist art. We saw the Cubists using it, but it's going to play a role all the way through the 20th century. So it becomes a sort of catalyst, a sort of model for a way of describing how the world works and describing how you relate to the world, how the different parts of world experience relate to one another, and that they're all interconnected. Here are some of the later ones, the 3D blocks and building forms, and some of these designs in the lower right. I'll bring some of these images back when we look at Frank Lloyd Wright, because you're going to see some of his building plans that look exactly like that. Here's some designs. The one on the left is a Froebel design on beauty. It's one of the classes they did on the concept of beauty. And then now here we've got Mondrian in 21 and 24. He's not consciously thinking this, it's just embedded itself on his mind that this is a way that we describe the world. The grid for Cubists, the analytic Cubists, was, I used the metaphor of a scaffold, because a scaffold is like a 3-dimensional grid. A scaffolding, if you've seen scaffolds up, right, they're 3-dimensional grids. It's what they are. They're structure. I mean, they're the essence of the idea of structure. And from that metaphorical scaffolding, the Cubists hung these planes because they, number one, were still tied to the real world. You can see violins, you can see people, you can see music, where Mondrian isn't tied to that. And they're also tied to the idea of space. Like Cubist works have a shallow space. They're very flat, but there's still a space. whenever you have like a plane in front of another plane, you've created a space. One's on top of the other. That means there's a space there, and they're moving back and forth over space. For Mondrian, the grid is similarly a framework, but not a real life three-dimensional framework, something else entirely. So now he's minimized, simplified, and reduced. My favorite comparison is this one. And this is another essay topic. Write me an essay on these two and compare them. Well, if you were here when we talked about Malevich, we know how deeply rooted that is in Russian mysticism, and that tradition of icons and the power of images to reveal things. I talked about revelation, how that's what medieval icons were for, right? You meditated on an icon because it was supposed to reveal something to you. It was a mystical tool, the purpose of which was revelation of some sort of secret knowledge. That's why you looked at an image of the Virgin Mary and Christ child. It would transport you. You would have a spiritual experience. For Malevich, that experience had to do with this new world that was being created. This is 1915. It's pre-revolutionary Russia, but those revolutionary ideas were in the air. This thought that we were now going to build this new spiritual utopia, because that's what they thought they were building. In Russia, it was because of the Russian Revolution. In the West, it was because of World War I. But afterwards, they believed they were entering this new spiritual age. And this was the language of that new world. It was a collectivist language. Now, both of these speak with a collectivist language. That's part of constructivism in general. Remember that also for Malevich, constructivism was literally about constructing a new world. Squares were building blocks of a new world. That's one thing that a square could be. It's like a block. It's a building block. It's a metaphor for building this new age, this new world. For Mondrian, who's not Russian, he's not gone through a revolution, and he's not necessarily starting at ground zero, building a new world as they were in Russia. But nonetheless, he was still a believer that a new spiritual age was going to come out of World War I. You know, World War I, of course, at the time wasn't called World War I, it was called the Great War. And it was referred to as the war to end all wars. And my grandfather fought in World War I, and he used to always refer to it as the war to end all wars. And I always thought he meant, well, he just meant, well, it was a really big war. That was the war to end all wars. It wasn't until much later that I realized that's not what he meant at all. That's not what any of them meant when they called it the war to end all wars. They were being very literal. They believed that we fought this war for one reason. We went through this hell for one reason, so that there would never be another war. This is the war that ends all war. If only, right? But they still believed that until the 30s, when it became more evident. It's another reason for the Roaring '20s and the optimism and the utopian idea. We've not just won a war, we've ended war. There'll never be another one. Live it up. Lasted for 10 years. Right? Yeah, lasted for a little while. So that utopian sensibility is still there. Mondrian is still looking for this language, for this new world, this new utopian era. It's not going to be as political as Malevich. It's not going to be based on, you know, the Bolsheviks taking power. But nonetheless, it's still seen as a new utopian world that is for everyone. There's a sense of equality in all of these. It's a rejection of elitist art. How is this a rejection of elitist art? Remember the end of the hand of the artist. There's no hand of an artist here. I talked about that last time. What does that mean? The individual mark making. It's called the hand of the artist. We can see the hand of the artist, meaning I see something in here that's unique to that person. Sometimes it's brushwork, sometimes it's whatever, but it's something that's revealed in a painting that's unique to one person. We call it the hand of the artist. That's an elitist concept after World War I. That's how that's seen. It's seen as selfish. It's just about you, you, you. Art should be something we can all make. There shouldn't be any individual identity in the work of art. It should be a collective idea. Could any of us all make it? That's why these works are so simple and so reduced. You know, when someone says, well, I could do that, that's simple. Right, you got it. That's the point. You could do that. It's not supposed to be something hard to do that only a few elite people have the ability to do. It's supposed to be something anyone can do. I've removed that elitist individuality and stuff from it. This is the language of the world we live in now. We're equal. We live in this new age. We don't have elitism anymore. So you've got to have that in mind when you look at that is always a part of it, even when it's not something he like sat down and thought about and did consciously. It's one of those things that was simply in the air. It's what everyone accepted as the new reality. And it's why this is the image of the 20s. This is the image of the 20s, at least part of the image of the 20s. And of course, then this is sort of the final stage. These are the sort of culmination of that project, the ultimate duality. The other things he talks about in his books is he's interested in like dualities. Why do we live in this world of dualisms? Why is that the underpinning and the frame of human existence, is this duality? And he came down to the point that, well, we see everything in dualities, or our world is shaped around them because of the core duality, that there's one core duality that defines human existence. And that duality is what defines us as beings. And that is our dual nature as spiritual and physical beings. There are two sides to human life, and that is the spiritual being and the physical being. And all other dualities are just expressions of that one core. And if you can understand that one core duality, that at our center, we are torn because we are two things. We are spiritual and we are physical, and we have never reconciled them. In fact, there are whole movements in art that have dealt with this idea of reconciling our physical and spiritual natures. I mean, that's not a small issue in human history, philosophy, literature, anything. I mean, much of human endeavor has been an attempt to understand our dual natures as physical and spiritual bodies, at least as it was believed at that time. So understanding that, and he talks about that in his writings. So in the end, it all comes down to that. His goal then, it's not all these little dualities of, left and right or male and female. It's that one core, if you can reconcile it. That core, reconciling that duality. And that's why when we look at something like this, something so simple in many ways, it's really a reflection of the most complex concept that human beings ever attempted to understand. And that is their basic nature as a physical and spiritual being. So the simpler the image, the more complex the idea behind it. It never fails in art, never fails. And this is a perfect example of it. Now, having said that, I think it's perfectly fair for anybody to ask, am I supposed to see that when I look at this? Am I supposed to like get all of that? Obviously, no. There's no way you look at this. And like you might get, I think what you could get is the idea of balance somehow, that, it's because balance is clearly a part of it. Because he's not only balancing vertical and horizontal, but he's balancing the primary colors. I mean, this is reduced in many ways to the simplest form. And artists have been doing that since the beginning of the century, right? This reduction simplification, but in very different ways. Now it's reduced lines to black lines, it's reduced forms, vertical, horizontal, it's reduced colors to the three primaries, red, blue, yellow. So it's about as reduced as you can get, trying to get to these core ideas. But, and was it naive for him to think that everybody's going to get this and everybody's going to do this? Well, a lot of things seem naive when you look back at them, in time. Of course, it was a bit naive. Nobody was going to get this. But that wasn't really the point. This is him figuring it out and working it out. But it really was ambitious and to our eyes, a bit naive that this was somehow going to happen. But this was a utopian period. What I love about it is they believed these things. They design buildings, nobody knows how to build. They paint paintings, nobody knows how to interpret. But this core belief that you'll get there, we'll figure it out, we'll work it out. There's something so optimistic about the 20s that it makes me long for a time when people had that kind of optimism and took those kind of chances. So this is where Mondrian is coming from, and this is the kind of work that we're most familiar with. He came to New York in 1940, and we will be talking much later about European artists coming to America. When World War II begins, even before that in the 30s, artists started fleeing westward. Totalitarian regimes are running throughout much of the 30s. People are flooding westward, and eventually a lot of them end up in New York, and that's really important. So Mondrian is there in 1940, and he actually begins changing. Unfortunately, he only lives 2 more years. It would be interesting to see where he would have gone, because he is starting to move into another direction. He's starting to move to reconnect with the material world, and this is New York City. He loved New York. He was obsessed with New York, particularly with jazz. And jazz in the 40s plays a huge role in art. A lot of artists are very influenced by jazz. They come to America, and they get caught up, and that was America to them. When I start seeing images like this, now this is clearly different. This is much more dynamic than he's done before. There's an energy there. I can't help but start seeing things like streets laid out, grids of a city, particularly this, okay? He titles it Broadway Boogie Woogie. We have come a long way from where he was before. He's dealing with the world he's living in now, not philosophical ideas that are sort of way above most people's thoughts. This is very influenced by jazz. It has this sort of rhythm, this sort of syncopated rhythm to it. Broadway Boogie Woogies, the energy of the street. Now is where I see streets, I see buildings, I see yellow cabs moving. It's like what you see from the top of a tall building in New York as you look at the streets. So it's about the energy, and it's totally different. It may still be vertical, horizontal. It may still be 3 primary colors, but this is how differently you can use those same forms. You can use the same forms to talk about entirely different things. And it's interesting. And he gets downright radical before he dies. Victory Boogie Woogie. Diagonal canvases. I mean, my God, he's still not creating a diagonal line, but a diagonal canvas. I mean, to Mondrian, that's like, he never made a diagonal line in his life. He made curvilinear forms, but this is really radical. Of course, Victory Boogie. My students always want to know, why is it called Victory Boogie Woogie? Those words mean nothing to them. They don't understand what Boogie Woogie is, let alone victory. But, I was born after the war, and I remember cartoons about the war and everything was victory this and victory that. I mean, it was just a word that was used about everything, certainly even throughout the 50s. You heard it after the war. During the war, you would have heard the word victory about everything. So Victory Boogie Woogie is just a moment in time and a clear change of direction. Yes?
You said it was incomplete when he died.
Yeah.
How long would it have taken physically for him to do it?
Well, now these aren't big. none of his are very big. They're like this, which helps. They're also very flatly painted, which is very quick. He would have used tape, I'm sure, to lay out the lines and then paint them very quickly. So they wouldn't take long. This would have taken longer just because of all of the taping have to lay out there. Taping it would have taken all the time, but not a great deal of time. And they're very flat, so, well, it's actually not all that flat. I'm going to take that back. Many of the squares are not all that flat. It looks very, very flat and slick here, but if you see one in person, you see brushwork, there are variations. So it's not as flat and slick as it actually seems.
He did not turn out lots and lots of paintings. Or did he? I don't know.
Was it a dolly or a?
With what? Sorry?
Was it a dolly or something else?
Yeah, no, he was not. He was not a dolly. So he did. There's a few, but it's not like he's not in the category of very, very few or a whole lot. He's just somewhere right there.
He made a living doing this. At the time.
Well, see, making a living is a whole different thing. But yes, he did. He was very well known. I mean, he was a major figure in Europe. He was, he would have had collectors. He sold books. One thing that shocks me sometimes is when I realize how little it used to cost to live as opposed to today. People used to live on very little and be able to do it. Today, the whole different percentages of income are required to live physically. But yeah, he did fine. The other member of the Distill group that we know, and there were others who were on the fringe, but the other one who was the co-author of the Manifesto of Distill, Theo van Doesburg. Van Doesburg was the sort of face of the group. He's the one that traveled and did the speaking, and he was much better known at the time than Mondrian was. So Van Doesburg was a major figure in Europe, more so than Mondrian. This is one of his paintings. It's called Color Study for a Building, and it really shows you that relationship to architecture. Van Doesburg never embraced the deep philosophies of Mondrian. He's much more of a designer. His work is much more design rather than philosophy. He's not. And this is very much a design for a modern architecture. Bring this back when we look at architecture, because there was a Distill architecture that we're going to look at later. But the comparison I love is this one with Liszewski. We talked about this at length last time. It's very Russian, the way he's embracing space, that relationship between paintings like this and architecture. The relationship between painting, sculpture, and architecture are very close during this period, and they relate to one another in very interesting ways, as Liszewski is creating this literally an installation, a space that you move into and through. Like this, for example, this is one of Van Doesburg's. This is absolutely about design. I mean, this has none of that subtle balancing act. The squares are all the same. It's a design, and it has more to do with architecture and really nothing to do with philosophy. He calls it composition in halftones. That's fine. Nothing philosophical about it. Quickly, Distill furniture, Gerrit Rietveld's furniture. I'll remind you of some of these when we look at the architecture. You can almost guess what the architecture might look like. There was one of these in the Nelson Gallery. I think it's still there. Rietveld's is one of the most famous chairs of the 20th century. And it's clearly related to what Mondrian is doing as a design as opposed to a philosophy. Now, the time we have left, I want to talk to you about really one of the most important places in Europe during this period, and one of the most important institutions in the Western art world, and that is the Bauhaus. Anybody heard of the Bauhaus? Excellent. Wow, that's great that it's known now more than it's actually a made-up word. Bau means build, and house means house, but it's not the word for architect. It roughly means the place of makers. or the place of people who make things, or the place of people who build things. So it's a made up word. That's what I love about German. You can make words up. That was the one place, the only language I've ever studied where they let you just make up words. And I just thought that was so fun. Anyway, 1919, 1933. And we'll look at its different locations in a moment, and we'll talk about it's a building. So we're going to talk about the buildings of the Bauhaus, but we're also going to talk about it as a school. It's a school, a very important, unique, one-of-a-kind institution that becomes the model for all art education from then on. Everything about the Bauhaus is about how we think about art today is created in the Bauhaus. Also, most of the things in our world that we live in and use, all are designs based on Bauhaus design. Even the logo down there, that profile, it always reminds me of Liszewski's New Man from that Russian poster we looked at last time. Sort of the human being now reduced to this almost machine aesthetic features in the Bauhaus design. The Bauhaus creator is Walter Gropius. The Bauhaus was created, so what did I have here? The Bauhaus created by the merging of two schools. So it's an interesting experiment. There was a traditional arts and crafts school that was run by Henry van de Velde, who was he was a Dutch Art Nouveau artist who was in Germany running this arts and crafts school. And there was a traditional fine art academy, more like the fine art academies we talked about that ran through the whole 19th century, a fairly traditional art academy. And those two merged and gave birth to something completely different. In fact, they kind of had to make it up. It was experimental. Like, what does this mean? How do we even join these two entities? And Walter Gropius, along with Van de Velde, were part of that. And Gropius was the first director of the school. He was also an architect. The fact that all three directors of the school were architects was important. It wasn't a school of architecture. They did teach that. It's one of the many, many things, but it was run by architects. It was run by people who had a certain way of thinking about things, that underlying metaphor of architecture that was driving painting and every other medium was behind it. And we're going to come back to Gropius in detail in a minute. The image you see on the right is Cathedral of the Future. It's a woodcut, and we actually have a finding here in the Nelson Gallery as well. Gropius, that's a quote from Gropius, the ultimate aim of all creative activity is a building, which is an interesting statement when you think about it. And why choose as their symbol that image, the Cathedral of the Future, was the image on the cover of the prospectus for the school. So it became a symbol, that Cathedral of the Future idea. What does that mean? We know what cathedrals were in the Middle Ages. What's a cathedral of the future? What they tapped into in this, linking to sort of the Middle Ages, when cathedrals were built in the Middle Ages, they were places where every possible art form was involved. On the grounds when a cathedral was going up, you would have maybe 100 different guilds on site of craftspeople all working toward the completion of this building. It wasn't just architecture. You had glass workers and metal workers, and you had ceramic workers, and you had people from every craft making things. It was a place where you would have all these artists working together on this one project. And in the end, it would have paintings in it and be covered in sculpture and have beautiful stained glass. It was the ultimate symbol of all of the arts that comes together, the Gesamtkunstwerk, which many of them talked about, the total work of art. Wagner talks about it. I mean, that was Wagner's goal in opera, was the total work of art. Well, the cathedral became the symbol of that. That's what they wanted to recreate, was a place like the cathedrals of the past where all the different arts and crafts would come together. That's what the Bauhaus is. I'll talk about the phases in a minute. Rescue art from isolation. That's again, that rejection of that elitism. You know, one fine artist over there working by himself and one sculptor over there working by himself. Stop that. And then you've got craftsmen over here working by themselves. No, it's just, we're all together, we're all equal, including arts and crafts. One of the truisms of art has been, at least from the Renaissance on, was this separation of arts and crafts. Like these are two different things. Arts up here, crafts down here. That's something that's been part of the art world. It wasn't in the Middle Ages. You know, those cathedrals, you had fine artists, craftsmen, everybody was working together. That's the world they're trying to get back to. That's actually finally the world we're in. It took most of the 20th century for that to actually happen. But that was, I mean, we don't really have those concepts anymore. Art, craft, that's art, but that's craft. Yeah.
So just a question. So we also had arts and crafts here. Was that the same thing?
What do you mean?
So there was an arts and crafts sort of period.
Oh, the movement, arts and crafts movement.
Yeah.
That's really not, that was 19th century. And it was an attempt to elevate craft. It wasn't necessarily an attempt to unite fine art and craft, but it was an attempt to elevate crafts. And then that carried into the Art Nouveau moment later, Art Nouveau at the end of the 19th century. So yeah, that's a 19th century conception. But certainly it's true here. They didn't really succeed in doing that. Throughout much of the 20th century, people still thought of craft as differently. But after World War II, as we get into the postmodern world, today we are definitely in a world, art schools will teach all the things that used to be considered craft. They're part of an art department today. So elevate craft, unite art and craft. And then most importantly, establish contact with leaders of industry. Now, what the heck, why do you need contact with leaders of industry? There was an earlier period in the 19th century. It's a good lead-in, actually. Thank you. You just led me into this discussion. During the arts and crafts and Art Nouveau period, Art Nouveau was very much about going back to hand making things, right? It was anti-industrial. Remember, 19th century was very much in the arts, was very much about anti-industrial. In the 20th century, they love industrialism. 20th century, no. So they wanted to go back to hand making things. Art Nouveau was a total failure. Might have been beautiful, but they did not, nobody's going to go back to hand making things. Yes, the things factories were turning out were ugly and soul destroying, which is the terms that they used. But the answer is not going to be, let's get rid of our machines and go back to making things by hand. That's never going to happen. So that was a failure. So in the Bauhaus, they still feel that machine-made products are ugly and dehumanizing. So what's a better solution? Why don't we get some artists involved in designing these things, and then they won't be ugly? As an idea, it's something we take for granted. Every business out there, everything you wear, touch, this pen was designed by someone. Everything is designed. It's not just factory workers out there deciding what something should look like. Every business has a design department. I used to talk to, we would always get these, prospective students coming in, and their parents would come with them to tour the department and all of that. And parents always have the same question, what is my son or daughter, what are they going to do with an art degree? Is there anything out there? And I have to explain to them that every single business in the world has a design department, and everyone in that design department is an artist. You have a much better chance with an art degree of moving into a professional job than in any other degree offered at the university. There's not one other department at the university that can tell you, we'll guarantee you got a job if you're good, if you're any good at all, because there's need for hundreds of designers, and there's no separation today between art and design. If you're studying art as a degree, you're going to get a design education, which means you can pursue design as well as your own personal fine art. So that's what we're talking about here. Here it begins. This is the first place where people had that idea. So why don't we, if we're going to teach our students to design things, why don't we work directly with industry, get some of these things that are coming out of the Bauhaus and get them in production immediately? And I'm going to show you some products later that we still have today that are still being produced under their original contracts from the 20s. Before we look at the program of what's taught, let's look at the building itself, because first of all, it's opened in 1919 in Weimar. This is happening during the Weimar Republic. We've talked about it before, that chaotic, corrupt period in Germany. It begins right after the, remember, in 1918, there's an attempted communist revolution in Germany. It fails, and what comes out of it is a republic. It was centered in Weimar, so we call it the Weimar Republic. It was a very corrupt period. There was runaway inflation. There was a lot of violence. We saw imagery that depicted that violence in Germany. And in the midst of all of that, the Bauhaus is beginning. In 1925, they decide to move to Dessau. Dessau is a German city right in the middle of the industrial district. That's why they wanted to move to Dessau. They wanted to be right in the middle of all the factories. And that's when they built Gropius design. He's the architect to design the new Bauhaus. When we think of the Bauhaus, this is the building we think of, the one in 1925. And it is Bauhaus style. It's a reflection of Bauhaus architectural style, but also the design philosophy for everything that was designed and made at the Bauhaus. It was, there's basically three buildings, three parts that are connected. It has the administrative, I think which one is which. This, I believe, is the dormitory. This is where students lived. This is the classrooms. This is an administrative wing. And then this is the workshop wing over here. This is the workshop wing. And we'll look at that in more detail and talk about that as well. So they lived there. It was a community. It was like an experimental artist community. It was like the place to be. It was where all the ideas were happening at that moment in time. And the students understood it. They really did. One of the most radical things about it was literally what you see here. You know, you drive by this building today and you probably wouldn't look twice at it. It looks so ordinary in our eyes. That just speaks to how influential it was. The fact that this is ordinary in our eyes. That was most definitely not ordinary looking at the time. That was a radical design in its simplicity, in its clean lines, in its refusal to reference. It's not neoclassical. It's not neo-Gothic. It doesn't have columns all over. It's clean. And that is one of the most important characteristics of Bauhaus design philosophy. Clean lines, no ornamentation. In architecture, when you stick columns on it and add stuff to a building, that's called ornament. So no ornamentations, not even any wind lines or sills around the windows, just clean. And that's more than anything, when we think of modern design, that's what we think of. Clean lines, no ornamentation. Even the name on it, people would like stop and stare at the name Bauhaus. This is how German was written at the time. This is German text. Nobody wrote like that. Look at the script there, the words, the simple letters. Nothing, no, just no serifs, no, I mean, this is considered Gothic. Old German script is basically a Gothic script. The windows, the cleanness of the windows and lines. Here's the buildings again. It is today a UNESCO Cultural Heritage Site, and it is still a School of Art and Design, although it was closed for a very, very long time. In 1933, Hitler's in power. He forces them to move back to Berlin, but everybody knew that this was a dangerous place to be, so they closed within a few months and everybody fled west. And I'll talk about what happened to the Bauhaus teachers in a little bit. The workshop wing was, and this is Gropius's design, the first use of a curtain wall or a glass curtain wall. A curtain wall is a wall that does not support anything. In other words, it just hangs there. And if the wall is not supporting anything, then there's no reason it can't just be glass, because it's not really a supporting wall. This is the first use of a glass curtain wall, so that you would have light coming in the workshop, all 3 floors, nothing blocking the light. But, you know, again, it's normal now. Go look at any skyscraper, glass curtain walls everywhere. But this is the first use of it. This is the inside. You can see these are the supports. So the external, where the glass is, the wall supposedly isn't really what's supporting the building in any way. The Cathedral of the Future. Okay, we already talked about that. Now they're embracing this medieval metaphor, medieval guilds. They embrace the language. Some of it is kind of silly, but it's like, nobody's done it before, so I don't know how to do it. So I'm just going to make this up. So instead of calling, there weren't professors, there were workshop masters. Masters is the terminology of the guilds, and not just the Middle Ages, but throughout, you know, the history of art. There were guilds. This is how craftspeople worked, in guilds and terminology. You had masters and you had journeymen and you had apprentices. And so this is the language they used. You had workshop masters, you had masters of form, Goal, the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art. They taught, there were areas in a lot of different fields. They taught ceramics, weaving, carpentry, metals, printed graphics. They had a print shop. I'll show you some of their posters. Mural painting. The only painting was mural painting. They didn't teach easel painting. They did teach color. They did teach like color theory, at least for a while. Glass courses, certainly architecture, various theory courses. The most important course, as far as we're concerned, for art education today was the first use of the forecourse. Forecourse just means literally the before course or preliminary course. The idea that you don't just jump in and take a course in making something. There's something you should study first. That's a unique idea. It's something that's part of every art program in the Western world anyway. You have to take what are called foundation courses before, you know, you want to be a painter. You don't just jump in and study painting. You study 2D design, you study color theory, you study drawing. The idea that there are earlier things to study that can prepare you for working in your field. I mean, the old model, the old guild model, and even the old academy model is you just jump in, start doing your thing. You're not any good at it, but you learn from watching other people. That's how you learn. But this is different. This believes you have to learn some things preliminary to that. Now, what should those things be? You know, what should you know before you jump in and start working in your medium? Well, people had different ideas of what that course should be. Well, this is just a little diagram that shows all of the different fields of study. A really interesting person, Johannes Itten, the first person who taught, he did teach painting as well, but he was the first to teach the preliminary course. And he believed in they taught meditation, diet, and purification. They would sit around and meditate. They would have a certain diet. I mean, some of these ideas are kind of far out there, but nobody knew what they should be. This was to prepare you to make it, you know, you would meditate. You know, all this will disappear. This is early on. It was very experimental. Became much less so as time left. Oscar Schlemmer was very early. He taught painting as well, but he also taught theater. They also had experimental theater early on. This was one of his designs for the idea of thinking about a figure in space. His very famous painting, mural painting of the Bauhaus staircase. One of the most interesting phenomena there was the very famous ballet they put on. This was under Schlemmer. They did experimental theater. This should sound familiar. These are the costume designs. It's called the Triadic Ballet. And there are a lot of drawings and photographs of the costumes that was totally abstract. It was about the figure in space and movement of the figure in space. And the costumes would reflect certain aspects of movement, of the human movement in space. And it was a way of thinking about form and the human figure, but also about space and movement. So the designs themselves would reflect the costumes themselves would reflect the motion of the figure. Here are some of the images of them, photos that were taken of the triadic ballet. Very experimental time. Some of the other figures, the disc costume. And it should remind you of the Russian Victory Over the Sun, that opera that we talked about, the 1913 experimental opera. Now, for Russia, it had more to do with, like, Victory Over the Sun was about taking control of your own lives and through your own willpower, building a new world and not waiting for nature to change your world. It was about, the power of man, where the triadic ballet did not have those political overtones, but it's the same idea. It's an abstract theatrical presentation using these abstract costumes to communicate. By the 20s, this whole idea of constructivism was really huge in Europe. You had the Russians, you had the Dutch up in the Netherlands, De Stijl, you had the Bauhaus. They're all constructivists. They're all thinking in terms of a certain kind of formal language, a certain kind of geometry as a way of expressing their world. There was this huge, first of all, the International Congress of Progressive Artists was not just constructivist. That included everybody in 1922 in Dusseldorf. You had the Surrealists were all there, who we're going to talk about later. But a few days before the Dusseldorf Congress was to begin, a whole bunch of constructive artists, including De Stijl, the Russians, and the Bauhaus artists, all met in Munich, and they formed what they called the Constructivist International. These are political terminology. They're reference to the sort of political moment. And when they went down to Dusseldorf, they tried to take over the International Congress. They tried to force everyone to sign this document that said everyone should work in this constructive way. They tried to force the Surrealists to swear that if you're going to be in this group, you must work this way, that you can't work your way. It didn't fly, but it was an attempted coup. It was an attempt on the constructivists to take over all of the art of that century. And when we get to the Surrealists, you'll see, we'll talk more about like why that was never going to happen. But it was an interesting moment. It just sort of reflects the politics of that moment in time, like a revolution. Let's have a revolution. And it was very much like it was a revolutionary moment. There were all these failed revolutions, and the Russians were trying to hold together what turned out to be a failed revolution. Now, who shows up to teach at the Bauhaus but Vasily Kandinsky in 1922? A lot of people came and went as teachers at the Bauhaus. There were a few people there the whole time, but there were a lot of teachers that would come in and teach for a couple years, and then they would go. Well, Kandinsky comes in. In 1913, Kandinsky was, the expressionist. He's working in Munich, and it was this very expressive, non-objective art. But look what Kandinsky's doing by 23 under the influence of the Bauhaus aesthetic. I love this comparison because it's practically the same painting from two different points of view. One is the expressionist version and one is the constructivist version. So everything now is expressed in a slightly different language. The relationships of colors and lines are similar. It has a similar kind of movement and motion, but it's now constructivist. And the Nelson has a constructivist work by Kandinsky as well from this Bauhaus period. But he will move on and change again, but you're caught up in this particular moment and aesthetic. I think one of the most important people who taught there was Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. Moholy-Nagy is actually fairly well known. and an extremely important person and voice. And if I ever catch up to my notes, he was actually did a lot of design for films. A lot of the movies of the 30s he designed for. There's a movie, it's a British movie produced by Alexander Korda. It's called The Shape of Things to Come. It occasionally runs on TCM. I've seen run on that. It's a black and white. It's a science fiction movie about this place over a 100-year period. It's fascinating if you're interested in those early kind of futuristic films, but he was the designer, and you see his hand in all the designs of the futuristic world, and he designed a number of films like that. But he taught there. He replaced Itten, and he got rid of all that touchy-feely meditation diet stuff and brought in a whole different kind of foundations program, one which really defined the direction art was going, one that's very influential on the direction of art, one that was directed toward the nature of materials, the materials that you're working with, rejection of mysticism. It was about finding the nature of the materials. He constructed this 4-course on materials in which the students worked with anything. It might be cardboard or wire or ribbon or plastic, any sort of thing, material has properties. It has characteristics that things that it wants to do. Like this piece of paper kind of wants to curl up. It doesn't want to. It doesn't want to stand up like that. And certain kinds of flat metals want to curve. Certain kinds of viscous things want to flow. And basically, he just had them manipulating materials in an attempt to understand those materials, in an attempt to see what they do best, how they move, how they function. It's a totally new idea. Prior to this, artists had always looked at their materials, whatever it was, as something that you tell it what to do. You force it into a certain shape, or you force it to do what you want it to do. But this is a way of